All right, welcome to our first lecture. Of course, as you can see by the title, the name of this lecture is a crash course in ethical theory. Um, as you know, my name is Aaron Rosari. I've enjoyed reading your personal introductions, and judging by the fact that pretty much all of you have completed the first discussion board assignment, and many of you have turned in your first set of reading questions, I get the distinct sense that you're all getting settled pretty well. I want to mention here, I've been mentioning this in all my classes, live and online, that all of you have free access to Microsoft Word 2016. When you open your school email using Outlook, you will see Office 365 in the upper left, and when you click on that Outlook and look at the upper right corner, you'll see a place you can click on which enables you to download Word. This package includes Excel, PowerPoint, and the other programs. So now that you know this, I'll be wanting you to turn in your future assignments, or I want you to turn in your future assignments using Word. Okay. In an ideal world, so we're just going to kind of jump in here, all of you would have taken an Introduction to Ethics class, which has a focus on explaining the various ethical theories which have been proposed both historically and in more recent years. Our class is what is known as an Applied Ethics course or class, since our primary concern is to address very specific issues which arise in the context of medical care. Of course, it is better to apply ethical theory to specific issues once you have a prior grasp of the theory in question, but we will proceed just fine learning and applying ethical theory simultaneously. In some ways, this is actually an advantage from a learning perspective, since every principle we learn will be illustrated by concrete examples soon thereafter, drawn from a field that you have a special interest in. Lewis Vaughn, the author of your textbook, does a pretty good job introducing some theory at the beginning of the book before diving into specific issues in medical ethics. I guess technically he's a author slash editor, since it's more of an anthology once you get beyond these first couple chapters. Okay, it is to the question, what is an ethical theory, that we now turn our attention. Now, as you read or listen to this lecture, it's worth noting, I advise you to have a copy of your own answers to the reading questions in front of you. This will enable you to both add additional thoughts to your answers, which will give you a better comprehension of the material, or eliminate any information in your own answers which is either not accurate or clearly stated. So you can obviously feel free to pause the lecture at any time, especially now if you do not have your answers in front of you. Now, question 1A asks, what moral theories try to explain? Vaughn offers us the following answer to this question. A moral theory explains why an action is right or wrong, or why a person or a person's character is good or bad. The first thing to notice about Vaughn's answer to this question is that Vaughn is committed to the existence of moral facts. Vaughn, and most philosophers who have written on ethics, especially historically, have thought that what is morally appropriate and what is morally inappropriate is not a mere matter of opinion, but is rather something one could have true or false ideas about. Someone who adopts this view could think, for example, that any culture which legalizes slavery has done something that is in fact wrong, even if they are blind to the wrongness of what they have done. Let us refer to the view that there are moral facts which one can have true or false beliefs about, moral realism. Assuming that moral realism is true is, of course, a controversial assumption, at least in the context of doing academic philosophy. Indeed, way back, and as we'll see in a second, in pop culture sometimes as well, indeed, way back in elementary school, you were at least sometimes taught that moral realism is false. You may or may not remember doing exercises in which you distinguish between facts and values. And values were relegated to mere matters of an opinion. In an ethical theory class, as opposed to an applied ethics class, we would have time to argue about moral realism itself. We don't really have that luxury in our course. Yet, we will be more or less adopting moral realism without much argument for the purposes of this class. This is because, as the course proceeds, I want you all to argue about what should be done in response to various ethical dilemmas. When one argues about what should be done, one is in effect assuming that some courses of action are better than others. Hence, in practice, we will be acting as if there are moral facts. I myself believe that there are such things. But I understand if you're not convinced or kind of entered the class thinking otherwise. Many philosophers don't believe in these kind of objective moral facts either. For those of you who think that morality is in some sense a matter of taste or opinion, I encourage you to pretend to be moral realists and develop arguments in favor of the views you think are most plausible. Again, if this were a theory class, we could spend a couple weeks on this issue. And it's definitely worth doing. We just can't really do it here. Okay, now, the purpose of an ethical theory is to explain why some actions are right and why some actions are wrong, or why a person's character is good or bad. How does this work? Well, all ethical theories are judged by how well they account for specific moral judgments. Consider the following list of moral judgments. It is usually or always wrong to lie, cheat, steal, commit adultery, and murder. Notice first that in practice at least, we are all committed to the truth of this claim. We are even willing to put people in jail for doing some of these things. Hence, we have no problem judging such behaviors as unethical. Now, the ethical theorist wants to know, why are such actions at least usually wrong? What the theorist wants to discover is a general principle which applies to all of these cases. For example, perhaps it is wrong to harm innocent people. Maybe do not harm innocent people is the guiding principle of ethics. This is somewhat plausible, as lying, cheating, stealing, adultery, and murder are typically harmful. Yet this cannot be the full account. For one thing, sometimes harming an innocent person is morally acceptable. Playing football or boxing, for example, is arguably not unethical, even though football and boxing results in horrible things like brain damage, broken legs, I have football in mind there, and the affliction of pain. The fact that people consent to being tackled or punched has moral significance in these cases. Hence, the do no harm to innocent people theory, while it certainly contains at least a grain of truth, is too simple to be the complete story of why we should obey these do not lie, cheat, steal, commit adultery, and other principles. So my main point is that an ethical theory explains why actions are wrong, in part by figuring out what all, or at least many, wrong actions have in common, and what all, or at least many, right actions have in common. So again, we want this kind of general principle from which we can deduce the wrongness of these kind of lower level moral claims, like it's wrong to lie, cheat, and steal, at least most of the time. And that explanation, the principle not only has to cover the cases, it has to give us some insight into why exactly those actions are wrong. Now, let's turn our attention to question 1b. Perhaps some examples of such theories will help. Vaughan offers us a historically influential religious theory and an influential secular theory as his initial examples of ethical theories. The first theory he mentions is a divine command theory, and the second is utilitarianism. Now, according to divine command theory, right actions are those commanded by God, wrong actions are those prohibited by God. According to the utilitarian or utilitarianism, right actions are those that produce the greatest happiness for all concerned, and wrong actions fail to produce the greatest happiness. Now, we will be interacting much more with utilitarianism shortly. Hence, let us say a few words about divine command theory. Divine command theory has many serious objections. Indeed, even most religious persons who think about such things, they don't accept this theory. The reason is, well, somewhat obvious, at least obvious upon reflection. It follows from divine command theory that if God were to order horrible things like rape or genocide or the horrific torture of innocent people, that such actions would be morally justified. Yet, as Plato pointed out many years ago, about 400 BC, this is clearly false. Any deity who ordered such things would simply be an immoral or evil deity. There just doesn't seem to be any deep conceptual connection between an action being ordered to occur, even by God, and that action being the morally right thing to do. Might simply does not make right. Similar thoughts apply to a view which Vaughan doesn't discuss right here, known as cultural relativism, whereby the state and perhaps the body of laws passed by the state determines what is right and wrong. So to use an example, why should the fact that slavery is legal in culture X render slavery morally acceptable? Just because the powerful command something doesn't make it ethical. So, oddly, divine command theory suffers from the same objection that a kind of cultural relativity theory of ethics. The fact that the powerful say X is ethical simply doesn't make it ethical. The other obvious objection to divine command theory, and one which relates to our prior slide, is that it would be awfully difficult to establish that God's commands are in line with our common sense prohibitions against lying, cheating, stealing, etc. Remember, the main way we judge a theory is by seeing whether or not it accounts for such specific moral judgments. So let us proceed with our questions, and we will soon arrive at a discussion of utilitarianism. Vaughan proceeds to give us an important distinction between two general types of ethical theories. He distinguishes between theories which are primarily focused on evaluating actions and theories which are centered upon evaluating a person's character. He calls the former theories of correct action and the latter virtue-based theories. Both divine command theory and utilitarianism are act-based theories. We will not have the opportunity to discuss virtue ethics as the class proceeds because, as Vaughan correctly notes, most bioethical issues are focused on the evaluation of courses of action. Yet, virtue theory is worth knowing about. It's one of the three main types of ethical theory. So, let's look at it briefly. A moral virtue is a character trait which enables one to get along well with others in society or otherwise support the flourishing of a society. Examples include patience, bravery, honesty, and compassion. The virtue theorist is very concerned with the motives behind one's actions and the type of person each of us is becoming through the choices we make. For example, let us say that one is considering something horrible, like committing suicide, because one has a deadly illness that causes one constant pain. The virtue theorist would be very concerned with the motivation behind one's action. Is such a decision more appropriately labeled compassionate or cowardly? The virtue theorist wants to know how the decision to end one's life reflects one's deeper character and motivations, and how the act will affect the moral character of those who are aware that such an event has taken place. In contrast, a utilitarian would be more concerned with whether or not the action, the act of taking one's own life, would promote the net happiness, which also includes the absence of pain, of those affected by the action. So it would be both the person committing the act, that person's family, friends, and anyone else who's aware of the action and has some sort of response to it. And again, the focus wouldn't be so much on the motivation behind the act or the character of the person committing it. It would just be on the net consequences of the action itself. Another good example of how a virtue theory can be applied to a medical ethical issue has been supplied by Rosalind Hirschhaus in a widely read article on the issue of abortion, which is not included in our text. She thinks the person deciding for or against having an abortion should think deeply in how the decision reflects their overall system of values. So for example, is one deciding to abort in order to not have one's career interrupted? If so, does this indicate an imbalance in both the individual or society's value system? Or is this a reflection of a legitimate desire? So maybe one wants to avoid poverty, and giving birth might impoverish one, at least for a time. Hirschhaus does not answer these questions, but through the use of virtue theory, she brings in a number of angles on the question, which are usually ignored. Hence her article, which kind of serves as a good example that one certainly can apply virtue theory to medical ethical issues, even though we typically focus more on consequentialist or utilitarian theories and what are called deontological theories, which we'll now turn to. Okay, so we're going to leave virtue theory behind and focus on theories which focus on the evaluation of a person's actions. The book, or Vaughan, labels these theories of right action. And that's a perfectly legitimate title, and it's a distinction, character-based versus action-based. That distinction is in common use, so there's nothing idiosyncratic going on in the textbook. Okay, so action-based theories come in two basic types. There are consequentialist theories, which evaluate the rightness or wrongness of an action based on its consequences or results. For example, a certain type of consequentialist would not think that it is always wrong to lie. Each lie must be evaluated in regards to the consequences it would produce. So imagine an angry person shows up at your door and asks you, "Is Fred here?" You realize that this angry person may very well want to harm Fred, who is indeed in your house. You also realize that merely remaining silent will result in the angry person coming to the conclusion Fred is home. A consequentialist is likely to conclude that it is permissible to lie on such an occasion in order to avoid the likely harm which telling the truth would cause. In contrast to consequentialist theories are deontological theories. A deontological theory is one which states that the rightness of an action is not determined solely by its consequences. For example, some people think it is always wrong to kill an innocent person, even if doing so would save many other lives. Just think of some outlandish scenario where one can only save many by killing one innocent person. So let's say the mob, like the mafia, threatens to kill Smith's entire family unless you turn him over. Imagine also that Smith has done nothing wrong. and has not consented to being turned over to the mob. You might think that you can't forcibly turn Smith over, even though doing so would save many lives. This would be more of a deontological intuition. You might think that Smith has the right to decide his own fate regardless of the consequences. Indeed, deontological theories are typically based on the concept of human rights, which are said to be inviolable, not something that can be overridden or ignored just because good consequences would flow on a particular occasion. You can think of utilitarianism as being more or less synonymous with consequentialism. Some philosophers make very precise distinctions which separate these two types of theory from one another, but we do not have the need to do that. So, as we're kind of combining ethical theory with kind of applying it while we're applying it, we're not going to make nearly as many distinctions as we could. So hence, like the consequentialist, the utilitarian defines right and wrong actions in terms of the consequences of those actions. Utilitarianism comes in two basic forms. The act utilitarian is one who thinks that we evaluate each particular action based on its specific consequences in order to determine if that action is right or wrong. So for example, let's say that a very poor person is contemplating stealing food in order to feed herself and her family. This person let's just also stipulate, this person has no other way of obtaining food. The act utilitarian would compare the consequences of her stealing the food with the consequences of her not stealing the food. Whichever course of action would result in the overall best consequences in terms of causing people to flourish and avoiding harming them would be declared the right thing to do. Hence, the act utilitarian would most likely favor the act of theft in this case. The rule utilitarian does not evaluate particular actions for their consequences. What she does instead is she evaluates general rules or principles in relation to the consequences they would produce. Hence, the rule utilitarian wouldn't ask herself, is it right for this individual to steal in order to feed her family? She would ask, would allowing theft to avoid starvation produce good results on a societal level? If you were trying to decide what to do on a particular occasion, the rule utilitarian would have you ask yourself, what if everybody behaved as I'm about to do? If the consequences would be good, then your action would be permissible. If the consequences would be bad, your action would be impermissible or morally bad or wrong. Wrong would be the better phrase there. Now, the word impartial means unbiased. In what sense are utilitarian theories impartial? The basic answer to this question is that when a utilitarian tries to figure out what the right thing to do is, she takes into account the consequences for everybody affected by an action, and not just the consequences for herself who is committing the action. Hence, the utilitarian wants to know how acting a certain way will affect the overall group of persons affected by the action. Hence, it's not an overly self-focused theory of right and wrong. The consequences for oneself when one acts certainly gets taken into account, but no more than the consequences for others who are affected by your action. All right, so these questions, 2E through F, ask what an act utilitarian and a rule utilitarian would do in regards to a specific situation. The situation involves a very sick 10-year-old boy by the name of Johnny who is suffering greatly from a terminal illness. Vaughn asks you if a doctor ought to euthanize Johnny at Johnny's parents' request. Presumably, Johnny is in no condition to decide what should be done. There is no need for me to repeat the text here. What I would like you to do, however, is reread Vaughan's analysis now that we have discussed the act utilitarian rule utilitarian distinction. And as you're rereading this portion of the text, which corresponds to question 2, parts E and F, take special notice of the fact that the rule utilitarian is going to be more focused on the societal consequences of adopting euthanasia in such cases as a rule. So what if everybody were allowed to, who are in Johnny's situation, was able to kind of, or at least, sorry. So the rule utilitarian would have you consider all parents in a similar situation. And what if they all followed the rule of euthanizing persons in Johnny's situation? In contrast, the act utilitarian is going to be more focused just on the consequences for Johnny and his family. And that's just, again, this kind of morbid example. It's just by reflecting on the example, one can see the difference between the act utilitarian and the rule utilitarian. So, for the act utilitarian, again, Johnny's parents, they don't have to ask themselves about the general effect which would occur if everybody were to act in the same way they've chosen to act, because that's more of a hypothetical situation. They only have to take into account, according to act utilitarian, the specific consequences for their particular choice. And not so much, they don't really have to address the question, well, what if everybody behaved like we do? Okay. So, moving on a little bit. So we finished our discussion of utilitarianism, brief as it was, and let us now proceed to discussing a theory which is very much its opposite. If you remember, a deontological theory is one which doesn't only take consequences into account when determining the rightness of an action. This has historically not been how this term deontological has been defined, but Vaughan is just highlighting the difference between how consequence-based theories operate and non-consequence-based theories operate, and he's simply defining deontological as more or less the opposite of a consequentialist theory. So an extremely deontological theory is one which doesn't take consequences into account at all. Immanuel Kant is a philosopher who has defended just such a theory. Hence the answer to 3A is no. Kant does not take consequences into account. So what does he do? Well, Kant distinguishes between two types of imperatives. An imperative is a command or norm that one ought to follow. There are, according to Kant, both hypothetical and categorical imperatives. A hypothetical imperative is a course of action you should take only if you want to accomplish a specific goal. For example, if you want people to trust you, it makes sense not to lie to them. If you are being honest only because you happen to have the goal of getting others to trust you, then you are treating be honest as a hypothetical imperative. If you didn't have gaining others' trust as a goal, you wouldn't have a reason to be honest. If this idea that we ought to be honest was a merely hypothetical imperative. But Kant does not think that moral imperatives or norms or principles work this way. Rather, Kant thinks that moral imperatives are what he calls categorical in nature. Kant thinks you ought to be honest and never lie, regardless of what your goals are. Indeed, Kant thinks you ought to tell the truth, even if doing so were to result in great harm to either yourself or somebody else. Kant thinks that duties are absolute and that whether or not you do what duty requires in no way depends upon the consequences of your actions. So this leads us to the formulation of Kant's basic ethical principle, what he calls the categorical imperative. Kant's categorical imperative can be formulated as follows: always act in a manner such that the maxim of your action could be willed to become a universal law. So just kind of absorb that for a second. We're going to break it down and kind of explain it. So a maxim is a motivation, some sort of, it's roughly a motivation. It's more like a motivation or goal and a means of accomplishing that goal. What Kant wants us to do when thinking about the morality of an action we are considering is to first think of both what we are doing and why. We can also add and how. So for example, let's say you want to cheat on a test in order to gain an advantage. The maxim of your action would then be, I will cheat in order to gain an advantage. Now, Kant then wants you to pretend that this maxim or law or principle has become universalized. In other words, imagine everyone decided to act this way. Thus far, Kant's theory sounds like a version of rule utilitarianism, but it's really not, so let's see why. Okay, so you are thinking of what would happen if everyone cheated. Well, the net effect would be that we would no longer use tests as a measure of a person's skill, since they would now be worthless for that task. Hence, universal cheating would render the act of cheating illogical, and that one could no longer reach the goal that cheating is designed to reach. What Kant focuses on is that there is something logically or conceptually incoherent about cheating, about everyone cheating. Again, this is because if everyone cheated, the goal of cheating could not be reached. This is a very different reason for rejecting cheating than the one a rule utilitarian would offer. The rule utilitarian would direct your attention to the fact that something of value, the ability to test people's level of skill, would be lost if everyone cheated. So there'd be some sort of negative consequence if everyone cheated. We'd no longer be able to use tests to test skill, and we have a lot of need to do that. But Kant's not worried about that, because Kant's not a rule utilitarian. He only cares about the fact that universal cheating would render cheating pointless, and that the very goal of cheating could not be accomplished. So hopefully you kind of see the difference between Kant's approach and the rule utilitarian's approach. And this is why Kant's theory is not in the least bit a consequentialist theory. So just give one more example. Take lying. The rule utilitarian would say something like, if everybody lied to each other, trust would break down, society couldn't function, and those are really bad consequences. Kant wouldn't say that at all. He'd say something like, well, if everybody lied, no one would really trust that anybody is telling the truth anymore. Therefore, the point of lying would be undermined if everybody did it. Therefore, don't lie. Okay. I'd forgotten that I had used that example in the actual. Oh, that's funny. Okay, so this might sound mildly redundant. That's okay. So similar thoughts apply to the question of should one borrow money one does not intend to repay. Very similar to the question of should I lie. The maxim or motive would be to steal money by promising to repay it and not doing so, or something like that. Now, what if everyone behaved this way? Again, Kant's point is not that society would be worse off, which is what a rule utilitarian would focus on. Rather, Kant would point out that if everyone lied about such things, the lies would become pointless. No one would believe them, so no one would really go and make contracts anymore. Hence, universal lying or contract breaking undermines itself. Lying is only effective if one is believed to be telling the truth. Universal lying undermines the presumption of truth-telling, rendering lying useless, and again, similar thoughts apply to breaking one's contracts, which is a form of lying. Okay, now, in his writings, Kant has offered us another categorical imperative, which he thinks we must always obey. This is called the principle of respect for persons. The basic idea is that we should never use other people merely for our own benefit without taking their needs and desires into account. He states this as follows: always treat others as ends in themselves and not as mere means to another's end. This principle is very similar to the Golden Rule, which states we ought to treat others as we would like to be treated. The reason this principle is not a consequentialist one is that it prevents us from sacrificing another person's well-being for the well-being of the many. Kant interprets this principle in such a way that it prevents us from ever lying, cheating, or stealing from another for the benefit of some further person or group, because that would be to use them as a mere means to an end. Okay, so that's a lot of information, and you'll get some more opportunity to interact with these ideas, not only in future weeks, but also in this week's discussion board question. And I'm going to go ahead and end this presentation now, but be sure to look on Canvas, especially at the announcements in the Week 2 module, for some more information about what's coming up. Thank you.